Okay, Kevin, for the grand prize of $1 million, what color is the White House?
I know this.
5 seconds.
Oh, switching to Geico could save you a bunch of money on car insurance?
Okay. Judges? That's true, Kevin. They'll allow it. Congratulations. You're a winner.
Woo!
Geico, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Bee in Eden, which is being broadcast on Podfire Radio at the website, podfireradio.com. My name is SedonaDeb, and I am your hostess and the creator of this show. You can find me on the internet at slaythebankster.com. You can also find YouTube archives of the show, along with links to either my written transcript or a blog that accompanies each episode. Now, besides creating the Bee in Eden shows, I also write articles every week for the news website roguemoney.net. But if you just remember my homepage of slaythebankster.com, then you can jump to any of those features or find me on Twitter and Facebook. I'd like to thank the sponsors who are making these incredible shows at Podfire Radio possible, and also thank the folks at ambientmixer.com for the bee-buzz music you'll hear playing in between the breaks. May the wind blowing through the chimes invite you to buzz along with me as we explore lessons from mankind's past. Our goal here at the Bee in Eden is to begin anticipating our future by remembering our past. And along with that, today's episode is entitled From Berlin to Shambhala, and this is based on one of the blogs I wrote at the website, roguemoney.net. And we are going to take our first break here in just a minute, but I wanted to start off by mentioning a quotation from one of the top-ranking Nazi insiders at the Nuremberg trials. This is the man who was the Secretary of the Navy, basically, for the German Navy, and Hitler assigned him to be president of Germany just before Hitler either died or was moved, whichever you want to believe. But this is the shocking statement he made at his trial. He said, "The German submarine fleet has even now established an earthly paradise, an impregnable fortress for the Führer in whatever part of the world, was made by Nazi Admiral Karl Dönitz during the Nuremberg trials." We're going to dive into this story and talk about just exactly what may he have meant right after our break.
Whoa, a new digital music player. Thanks, Mom.
Oh, I'm glad you like it, because I can't wait to toss the big stereo. And now that we got your dad that big HD TV he wanted, we can throw out our old TV, too.
Hold up. You can't just throw out electronics.
Really?
They need to be recycled or donated.
And how would we do that?
It's so easy, Mom. Today, recycling electronics is just as easy as buying them. GreenerGadgets.org has all the info. We just enter our zip code to find a certified recycling center nearby. There are thousands of them, and new ones are being added all the time. Some of our local stores are even certified recycling locations.
I like that.
Did you know that some of the stuff in our old electronics could be used to make new products and conserve natural resources?
Well, okay then. Let's gather them up. What was that website again?
greenergadgets.org. We just enter our zip code and go.
And we're back. Right before the break, we introduced the character Nazi Admiral Karl Dönitz and the surprising statement he made at his Nuremberg trial about how the Nazi Party had built some sort of a paradise, an impregnable fortress to preserve their party. The Nuremberg trials were not the only place where he had made this statement. And in the previous installment of this series of shows about Antarctica, I mentioned that the first territorial incursion committed by the Nazi Party in 1939 was not really their invasion of Poland, which would happen later in the year in September of 1939, but rather their takeover of Norwegian sovereign territory at the northern tip of Antarctica. This happened in January of 1939. But why? What were the Nazis looking for? As this saga continues to unfold, I am gradually becoming more convinced that the early Nazi success in Antarctica provided the impetus for everything else that was to come in September of that same year. What I'm saying is that without the Deutsche Antarctica success in 1939, World War II might never have happened. But first, we must look at the temporal context of that decade. What else was going on around these events? On the one hand, we have a humiliated Germany struggling to cope with the aftermath of the First World War. Then, on the other hand, we have the rise of the anti-humanist movements as popularized by men like Friedrich Nietzsche and Karl Marx. The Industrial Revolution was in supercharged mode, and the Hegelian dialectic was on schedule to produce the future child of this marriage between Renaissance humanism and the anti-humanism of the 20th century. That entity we now see rising before us in the 21st century, the coming of transhumanist robots, mechanical human hybrids, and artificial intelligence. Now, on top of all of that, the Babylonian priesthood threw even more gasoline on the flames near the dawn of the 20th century by spreading the idea that a utopian city powered by some uber energy force named VRIL and inhabited by a race of superhumans sat at the center of planet Earth. Add a pinch of spice in 1929 when that prehistorical Antarctica Piri Reis map was serendipitously rediscovered, and the stage was set for the astounding events that were to happen throughout World War II. Now, we're going to go back a little further, back to the beginning of the 19th century, as far back as 1818. And this would be even a few decades before the birth of Adolf Hitler. And in 1818, a theory was already spreading that the Earth was a hollow shell. This has come to be known as the hollow Earth theory. They believed that there were openings several thousand kilometers wide at both the North and South poles. Even astronomer Edward Halley of Halley's Comet fame proposed this idea as a scientific theory. However, he was not the first to imagine such a thing. A quick perusal of the Wikipedia article about the hollow Earth theory reveals that all over the world and all through history, mankind has held a belief that some kind of paradise civilization existed before a global flood, and that it managed to survive that deluge by submerging itself underground. And if history and anthropology have taught us anything, it's that you should never discount a widespread ancient legend too quickly before you really investigate it. Now, fast forward a little bit to the year 1871. We're in the middle of the reign of Queen Victoria, and there is an author by the name of Edward Bulwer-Lytton who wrote several science fiction tales and poems and books. And he's famous for writing a book entitled The VRIL, The Power of the Coming Race. Now, note that this novel was written as a fictional tale. In his book, the hero falls through a subterranean cavern and then discovers a lost civilization of superhuman survivors of an ancient global deluge. VRIL was their civilization's power source, something like a philosopher's stone or the Force that is popularized in the Star Wars movies. This Force had the power of creation and destruction, which is a recurring theme that keeps finding its expression from the legends of the ancient goddess Vishnu up to our day with the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. And if this idea of a story of a paradise civilization that is found amidst the secret mountains of some ice-covered territory, that might remind you of a movie back in 1973 called Lost Horizon. I remember watching this as a teenager, and I remember being just captivated by the idea that some sort of perfect paradise was located where people could go and always live a young life and have basically immortality handed to them. The story was a popular one, and it continues to be down to this day. Now, even though that story was meant to be enjoyed as a fiction, that era's darlings du jour of the global priesthood picked up on it right away to use for their own ends. They began to suggest that VRIL was a very real magical force. It was yours for the taking, but you'll have to make contact with the ascended masters and really get back to your human roots. Occultists like Aleister Crowley and Madame Helen Blavatsky were leaders in promoting the idea of its existence within their circles of sophisticated intellectuals, financial tycoons, and forward thinkers of Europe and America. Now, the short story here is that an idea was being planted that the northern ancestors of the German people had access to the center of the earth and indeed could travel all over the earth, even to the opposite pole, via subterranean passages. The shamans of Tibet supposedly knew all about this, and they could provide the instruction for how to obtain this magical VRIL power. He who had the VRIL would be unconquerable. Go find Shambhala or Agartha or Shangri-La or whatever you want to call it, and you can rule the world as a superhuman ultra-terrestrial. Therefore, when the Germans faced defeat after the First World War, the soil was fertile for the rise of the esoteric beliefs of the Thule Society and eventually of those doctrines pursued by the secretive Ahnenerbe of the Nazi Party. The deflated Teutons desperately needed to find something to overcome the tyranny of what they perceived as their British-Israeli overlords, who now monopolized the oil industry. VRIL sounded like they needed. So, in 1938, the Germans began planning an expedition to Antarctica, and they invited famous American polar explorer Admiral Richard Byrd, or in the future he would have the title Admiral. This time he was Richard Byrd to lecture them about what to expect down at the southern continent. And remember, this is pre-war Germany. So ostensibly there would be no reason for the future Admiral to expect anything other than scientific motivations on the part of the Germans. Or so we are led to believe. Now, according to a Wikipedia article about this 1938 expedition by the Germans down to Antarctica, the public is told that the Reich's interest in Antarctica was simply to exploit her vast whaling resources. But when you read the article, I'll let you decide if this sounds like the preparations of a harmless whaling camp. The page says, on the 19th of January, 1939, the ship arrived at the Princess Martha Coast in an area which had lately been claimed by Norway as Queen Maud Land, and they began charting the region. Nazi German flags were placed on the sea ice along the coast, naming the area New Schwabenland after the ship. The expedition established a temporary base, and in the following weeks, teams walked along the coast recording claim reservations on hills and other significant landmarks. And then the article goes on to show that they took more than 16,000 aerial photographs. They flew all over the place, and they were definitely pursuing a reconnaissance mission over the entire area. And they were literally dropping little swastika flags all over the continent to mark their territory. And that's the end of that Wikipedia article, or that citation. Anyway, 8 months later, the world was at war by the time September of 1939 rolled around. Well, not quite the whole world. It was the world minus the United States. While the world was beginning to shake bloody hands with Hitler, President Roosevelt, along with the State Department and the U.S. Treasury, sent Rear Admiral Byrd on his own expedition to Antarctica. Now, for such a seemingly unimportant, useless continent, there sure seemed to be a lot of sudden interest down at the South Pole. Now, another Wikipedia page explains a little bit more about what Franklin Roosevelt's intentions were in 1939. And by the way, this is not the expedition that Admiral Byrd would later become even more famous for after the war. That one was called Operation High Jump. This was an expedition that President Roosevelt was pursuing just as the rest of the world was embroiled in World War II. And this Wikipedia page goes on to say, the objectives of the expedition were outlined in an order from President Franklin D. Roosevelt dated November 25th, 1939. The President wanted 2 bases to be established, East Base in the vicinity of Sharkha Island or Alexander I Land, or on Marguerite Bay, if no accessible site could be found on either of the other specified islands. The base that America came to set up came to be known as Little America. And the article goes on to describe what the GPS coordinates of it would be. And then the citation finishes, in view of the broad scope of the objectives and the unpredictable circumstances that always arise in Antarctica, it is remarkable that most of the objectives set for them were met. And that's the end of that citation. And in March of 1941, this American expedition was concluded. The ships turned home, and from that point forward, the United States threw itself into its own preparations to enter the bloody theater of World War II. Now, so those are all the events swirling around the world. Meanwhile, in the middle of all of this, a top-ranking Nazi party member decided to make a trip to Scotland. Now, we're going to take a break here, and when we return, we'll talk about the capture of Rudolf Hess by British authorities in May of 1941, and what did he know or possibly pass to the United Kingdom.
I've got the water, energy bars, and camera. I think we're set for the hike.
Almost. We need to protect our skin. Don't forget your wide-brimmed hat and sunscreen.
All right. I've got the hat. I've got SPF 30. Will that work?
Yeah, anything 15 or higher is good. Just make sure it says broad spectrum.
Great. Got it. I am not getting burned again. Let's go.
Learn more at cdc.gov/cancer.
And we're back. Right before the break, we were discussing the expedition that President Roosevelt had made, had the American forces made down to Antarctica in March of 1941. Now, just 2 months later, over in Scotland and England, a famous Nazi insider, Rudolf Hess, was making his own little flight, attempting to make contact with British authorities. And there has always been debate over whether or not the occult beliefs of the Thule Society, of which he was a member, really held any power over Hitler, or whether all of that was superseded by the famous Ahnenerbe group that Himmler established. And if you ever watched any documentaries on the History Channel, you've noticed that they have often portrayed shows that discuss the occult beliefs of the Nazi Party and how they were running all around the planet looking for objects that by which they could obtain some sort of supernatural power to give them world-dominating energy. Now, one thing we do know for sure is that Rudolf Hess was an original member of the Thule Society as well as a prominent Nazi insider. And in May of 1941, only 2 years after the German expedition to Antarctica and only 2 months after the American one, Rudolf Hess flew into Scotland and asked to meet with the Duke of Hamilton. This has always been one of the greatest British mysteries of the war. In theory, Hess offered a truce deal, but was rejected. Millions of lives could have been spared if the Anglo powers had accepted his offer, or that's the way the public has been told the story. However, another angle in all of this is that Rudolf Hess was a man with ties to many secret societies, and he had knowledge of the German Deutsche interest in the South Pole. Remember, Admiral Byrd was a Washington, D.C. Freemason, and of course, the ruling class in England was under the thumb of the City of London's bankers and really the descendants of the Knights Templar financial network. It was Rudolf Hess's Thule Society that sponsored the German Antarctic expedition of 1938. Now, I have a quotation here from the October 2005 issue of Nexus magazine about what may have been going on with Rudolf Hess in his decision to fly into Scotland. It says, it reminds us he asked to meet with the Duke of Hamilton. His plans for peace talks were quickly rebutted, and so began his 46-year incarceration. Hess's imprisonment is one of the most widely discussed mysteries of the war. As Christoph Friedrich claims, some believe that Hess was entrusted with the all-important Antarctic file. But whether this was a paper file or a mental note, one thing is for certain. Hess, Deputy Fuhrer, would have known everything about the Nazis' Antarctic intentions. Rudolf Hess was also an active member of the Thule Society, and his interest in Antarctica would have been on both personal and professional levels. Now note this, Hess, a keen aviator, used his position in both the Nazi Party and the Thule Society to meet Richard Byrd when he lectured the personnel who were heading for the Antarctic with the Deutsche Antarctic Expedition in 1938. And through his channels, Hess would have known everything that had been discovered in New Schwabenland. Now, Richard Byrd, a living legend throughout the world for being the first man to fly over both North and South Poles, was possibly the most well-informed polar explorer ever, and he divulged his vast knowledge and details of his exploits to the Nazis. Byrd's advice in his lecture and ultimately the Nazis' successful expedition to claim New Schwabenland may have given the Nazis conviction enough to establish a viable Antarctic base. Hess's flight and eventual capture a few years after the Deutsche Antarctica expedition meant that plans would have been underway. And that's the end of the quote from the Nexus magazine. So that's 1941. Now, 4 years later, Adolf Hitler would be supposedly dead by suicide or possibly transported in the spring of 1945 to the Southern Hemisphere, whether Chile, Argentina, or possibly even this base in Antarctica. Meanwhile, Rudolf Hess, who had been arrested immediately in Scotland in 1941, never saw freedom again. In 1946, he joined his colleagues on trial at Nuremberg. He was convicted and then sent to Spandau prison. Overall, he spent 46 years under custody and ended his life by suicide at Spandau. Repeated efforts by family members to get him released near the end of his life were constantly blocked by Russian authorities. Now, in contrast to this 46-year term that Hess managed to serve under incarceration, another German Antarctic Nazi insider got off with only a 10-year sentence. And that's the man we mentioned at the beginning of the show, the man that Hitler assigned to be his successor as president of Germany, the man who was in charge of the German Kriegsmarine. Basically, that he was the Secretary of the Navy, and he was really the man who is famous for building up the extreme functionality of the German U-boats. Now, here's another extract from this Nexus magazine that sums up the outcome of Rudolf Hess's role in this whole tale. The secrets he gave away in those 4 years, though dismissed officially as lunacy by the British government and at the Nuremberg trials, were taken seriously in some quarters, particularly after Britain had caught more of Germany's most powerful Nazis at the end of the war. Unfortunately, with Hess being imprisoned until his suspicious suicide in 1987, at the age of 97, all records about him are locked firmly away under the UK Official Secrets Act and will be for the foreseeable future. Only circumstantial evidence can be used to gauge how much or how little Hess knew about the Antarctic haven. Meanwhile, Admiral Karl Dönitz was convicted at Nuremberg, but he only served a light sentence of 10 years. He finished his life in Hamburg, Germany, writing memoirs and giving interviews. He was extremely vocal about his pro-Nazi views the whole time. He died of a heart attack on Christmas Eve of 1980, and his funeral was held on January 5, 1981. His funeral was attended by thousands of his comrades, and among those attending were 100 Knight's Cross holders. Now, it's interesting that at this time the German government forbade them from wearing their uniforms because the members of the German government felt that Admiral Dönitz had been too deeply involved with the activities of the Third Reich. And yet what a contrast. Everyone knew what a powerful person he had been in serving the Third Reich, and yet his sentence was only 10 years. Now, in our next future show of The Being Eden, we're going to talk about the events that transpired that swirl around Admiral Dönitz and just exactly what were the British expeditions doing down in Antarctica and the shocking discoveries that they made that involved physical evidence about a Nazi polar base. But we'll have to leave that for another time, and I do thank you all again for listening to this unfolding story, and it just seems to me that the story just gets deeper and deeper the way we go. But you're going to find, as the future shows develop, how all of this is affecting events that are happening even today. But we'll leave all that for a future time. And for now, this is SedonaDeb signing off and buzzing back to the Beehive. We encourage you to keep listening to the shows on Podfire Radio. And again, many thanks to the listeners and our sponsors.
Okay, keep your eyes closed.
Okay.
I want to show you my first ever painting.
All right.
Okay. Open your eyes.
Oh, that's a lot of colors and shapes.
So be honest. What do you think?
Well, I like how if you switch to Geico, you could save hundreds of dollars on car insurance.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Here, why don't I hold your paintbrush while you call them?
Geico, because saving 15% or more on car insurance is always a great answer.